the studio. This will be our 6th and final block for the Christmas tree applique project that we're working on. This month we have a beautiful block. It's almost like a church, and we also have the reindeer, which I think is really adorable. This particular video will be a little bit longer because we're also going to be piecing the wedges together, and we're going to be doing any of the applique that overlap from block to block, so we'll get all of those components caught up as well. So I'm going to get this all cleared off of here and we can get started on the applique process. As I like to do each month, I like to look through all of my pieces, and anything that was folded to get put into the packaging, I like to give that a quick little press. This still has its paper backing on it, so it's not going to be fused to anything that it shouldn't be. The house in this case also had to be folded to get into the packaging. So you can see how nicely, if you iron that crease comes right out. And that did activate the fusible web a little bit, but I don't have to worry about that because the paper backing's still on it, and I'm going to let that cool before I use it. So I can put those things aside, and then again I'm going to iron my paper pattern because it was folded up and it has some pretty deep creases in it, and I don't want those creases to translate into the applique components placement. So I'm just going to give those a little press with my dry iron. And then after I get this ironed, I can set the iron aside and get my light box out, and we can get to doing some of the placement on some of these components. I'm going to start by doing some of the compound pieces just so we can get them in place without the background fabric interfering with its thickness. So I'm just going to take the main component of the house, and I'm going to get it in place and put the front door on. My belly is pushing the pattern, no comments, from the peanut gallery. And now I can get a window in place. Actually, there's 2 windows. That steamer seam too has a tackiness to the back once you remove the paper, and allows these components to stay in place even if the fabric gets moved around. Sometimes if I'm confused about something, I can look at the color placement guide, which comes with every kit, and get something in place. For instance, we have 2 circles, but only one of these goes on here. The other one is for the reindeer. So I want to make sure I pick up the right item. I mean, I could always relocate them as long as I've discovered it before I fused, but I like to not have the problem to begin with. Now I'm going to go ahead and put this window in place as well, and then I can go ahead and put these onto the background and not worry about the placement of those through all the excess fabric. Most of these other pieces are individual layers, and I'll just be able to place them directly on the background and still see what I'm doing. So now I can move these 2 aside and get our background fabric in place and get on to the next piece. I'm going to go ahead and put my doorknob on, and I'm just shifting that aside a little bit so I can see through a single layer. so I can see about where height it goes on there. And now I feel like that's pretty good in place for that. So I'm going to set these aside and get my background fabric on here, and then we'll get to placing some more items. Now I can go ahead and start placing some of these items, but I'm going to have to shed a layer because it's getting warm in the studio today. So now I can put down my top of the house or a church. It looks more like a church to me, which would make sense since it's Christmas. And I can put the steeple in place. Then I can peel the paper backing off of the house. And since this is a really big piece, I can show you easily. If you ever have a problem peeling the paper backing off that you can't catch an edge, you can always make a score line. And I've used a clover pen here. You just don't want to go all the way through the fabric. You're just trying to get through the paper. And what this does is give you an edge to peel up. Bend it over, and now you've got an edge that you can peel to grab the whole piece. Now in my climate, I don't really have a problem with that Steam 2 sticking so bad that I can't get the edge up. But I know that's not always the case everywhere. Now we iron this at the beginning, and it's cool enough that I can go ahead and peel the pieces off. And when I have a piece that has a weird angle like this, I always like to get the point on right at the ridge of the roof. And then I can use a little bit of pressure. I've got my thumb up here at the top, and I can just pivot this piece until I get it right on the edge of that, the line of the roof. And it's always the fabric itself that I want to line up. I'm not worried as much with the pattern if there's any variance, because it's the fabric that's going to show at the end. It's not going to be the paper pattern. That pattern's going to be pulled away. No one's ever going to see it again. So I want to worry more about the lining up of the edges than I am worried about anything else. Now I can pull this back up a little bit and get my other components in place. Now we have the front steps leading up to the church. Every month I see this, I'm really thrilled. I love this green background color. I think it works really well with all of the different fabrics, the batik fabrics that were used in the kit. And green is one of my favorite colors. After we get this block fused, then we can go ahead and put some of these wedges together. If you wanted to get the kids involved, there's all different ways you could let them help with this project. Because we have the large paper backing, the placement guide, they could just place the pieces on the pattern, sort of like you would a puzzle if they were really young. If they were a little bit older, they might help you peel the paper backing off and get those components in place. And if they were a little bit older yet, they could use the iron with the Teflon pressing sheet as long as they had adult supervision. I'm going to have to look really close at where my reindeer head goes. Some of these components also here go off onto one of the other wedges, so I'll have to wait to finish some of these pieces until after. What I will have to pay close attention to is when I get to that point, is making sure I fuse everything that I've added. Remember our value lesson. If we have something that goes behind something else and we have a choice of value, we want the darker value to go towards the back, and that gives a sense of dimension to the whole project. I cannot exactly see through all of these pieces here, so I'm just going to lift up the piece a little bit to make sure I'm getting the placement pretty close. This is going to go back behind that green piece, so I'm glad I can lift that back up. I'm also going to utilize the cover color sheet so that I can see where some of these things go. I'm going to put my beautiful blue eyes on. My actual eyes are hazel, but this reindeer's eyes are blue. And then we'll give him his little pupils. He has 2 pupils and 2 nostrils, so we have to get all of those in place. Usually I wait till the end because these pieces always are hard for me to get off. Let's see, we have his little ears, and those will show right up on top. I do want to make sure that I'm putting the right one on the right side. A lot of these little pieces are mirror images of themselves, and so it's easy sometimes to get them in the wrong position, and something will look not quite right, and that'll be the reason. It's because we have the left on the right and the right on the left. Not that it would be the end of the world, but so let's see, is there anything else that I can put in place? I think everything else I have are the flourishes here. I have one more berry, a couple leaves, and the swirls. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this as it is and fuse these components in place, and then we can get to putting these wedges together, which we'll be doing over here on the sewing machine. So we have been through the fusing process a few times. So I might just fuse this off camera and then get right over to piecing, since this is going to be a little bit longer today. Okay, I have my final block finished. It's all fused in place in as much as I could finish with the wedges not being complete. Once I get these put together with the other wedges, I have some more of these little flourishes that I can put on, a couple of the spirals, leaves, and berries. Those will continue to go off here onto the next block. So I have all of my blocks fused, and now it's time for me to start pulling those blocks back out of storage and get these put together. So I'm going to match them up 2 by 2. I'm going to do block 1 and 2 together, block 3 and 4 together, and block 5 and 6 together. And then after I get those sewn and opened up, I can put any overlapping pieces on those sets, and then I can sew together the units 1, 2 to 2, 3, and then 3, 4 to 5, 6. Each time matching up any of the overlapping applique that is required. So I'm going to go ahead and shift things around a little bit. I need to set up my sewing machine, move my light box, and get rid of some of the clutter, which seems to develop very quickly around here. So let's get moving. Let's do it. And before you know it, here we are to piecing all of our 6 wedges together for our Christmas tree skirt. If you have retained your pattern, the instructions that had the cutting instructions also have the construction instructions, which is kind of a mouthful. And one thing you're going to quickly notice is that I didn't cut the center circle out on the pattern for all of my pieces. And one thing was that it was a little bit of a nitpicky little curve. But also, I'm thinking for myself, because I know the construction of my Christmas tree. I have a motorized tree stand that spins my tree, and it takes up a little bit more space in the middle. So what I might do after I get all my blocks or wedges assembled is make my inner circle a little bit larger. That'll also make it a little bit easier for me to get that binding sewn on in the curve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be matching up my wedges from this end, and when it gets to this end there may be a little bit of extra fabric, but I'm not worried about that because I know I'm going to trim that later. So what I'm going to do is lay piece number 1 on top of piece number 2, just the way they are in the instructions here. We're going to be sewing these together 2 wedge units at a time, and then joining the wedge units together, all except that last seam, which we'll leave open. And that's how you get this around the tree skirt, Christmas tree. You get the skirt around the tree. So I have my block number 2 here. I'm going to take block number 1 and set it on top, and I'm very carefully going to line up these edges, focused mostly on the bottom edge. And then I'm going to put some pins in here. And we want to be careful handling these edges. Every edge on this project is a bias edge, and bias edges stretch really easily. That's why we use bias binding. We cut it on the edge because it goes around curves and corners so beautifully because of that stretch. But we also could cause distortion with that stretch. So I'm going to go ahead and get this over to the sewing machine, but at the same time I'm going to pull out blocks 3 and 4 and get those pinned, and then blocks 5 and 6 and get those pinned, and I can run through all 3 of those seams really at the same time and get those taken care of before we press them open. I have my 3 separate units of 2 wedges each. I'm going to go ahead and do these seam lines. I've matched the edge up from the bottom of the curve up one of the straight lines. That was my reference point since I didn't cut out all of the curves for the very top of the wedge. This up here is where the center of the tree skirt would wrap around the tree itself, and I'm going to make my opening just a little bit bigger. And I'm going to do that after all the wedges are pieced. So I'm just going to be using a standard 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have just cotton fabric here. I'm just going to use regular cotton thread. It's just a very neutral thread. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this first unit together. carefully pulling out my pins as I go. As I said, I want to be careful not to pull too much on this because it's all bias edges. Because it's all biased, this might be a place where you'd want to put your walking foot on. Unless you have a dual feed machine. That's as far as I need to go on that first piece, so I can set that aside. And now I can just pick up one of the other wedges and get it sewn as well. And I'll continue doing that until I have all 3 wedge units complete. Then we'll press those seam allowances. I might press them open in this case. And then I can go ahead and put those applique pieces on top. I have my seam between the 2 block units, so I'm just going to go ahead and iron the top of that seam just to set the seam, and then I'm just going to iron those to one side. You could press these seams open, but the seams aren't really going to touch anything else, so it shouldn't be a factor on that. The only issue would be being able to see through the seam allowance to get to the applique pieces, but I think we'll be able to manage that with the few that we have. The next thing I think I'll do is see which one of the blocks have any applique going over the seam line. And if there are any of these that I've already done, I might go ahead and get those taken care of before I go any further with the seams. Because obviously the more we handle this, the more pieces we add, the more awkward it's going to be to get it positioned on the table on the light box. So if I could do it, any pieces of the missing applique now, I'm going to do those now. Starting from the back and going forward, this is block number 6, and it overlapped onto block number 5. So I'm going to go ahead and get these components with the paper backing off. Then we can get these pieces fused in place now that we have the overlap issue taken care of. And these appliques that overlap the seam in a way help to dissipate that piecing distraction from the overall image, because it helps blur the lines. You just want to make sure that that seam line is nice and flat. And it looks like I forgot to put one of my leaves here on the house, the church as well. So I can go ahead and get that in place. And once I get this block unit fused, then I can go ahead and move on to the next set and see what might be missing from that. On this particular set, I really only have these two pieces that I can put on now. I still have the arm of the snowman, but I have to wait until we get the next wedge units put together for me to do that overlapping seam. And in the pattern, that may be where the open seam is at, so I may have to shift where that goes, or cut a piece of it off, or I'm not sure what I'll do there yet. But now we have these two pieces in place. I can fuse these and get on to the next wedge unit, and I'll get that one finished. On this particular seam, I have the overlap of Santa's hat. That's down below, and then up above I have some of the swirl. So I'm going to tackle these one at a time. Remember, this is the piece that I had peeled off too early, and I put that back in place. And I can see that the pattern, that I'm off of the pattern a little bit, but what I'm going to be worried about is the actual placement of the fabric more than the pattern itself, because that's what's going to show at the end. My paper is going to disappear. So I have the hat and his little fur ball at the top done, and now I still have a few components up here, and due to shifting or misplacement or whatever, I'm having to rearrange this to get it where I need it. Even if this is off a little bit from this, I don't care. All I care about is one section at a time. So I'm going to get that as close as I can to being all in the right position, and then I'll go ahead and put these pieces in place. And I'm scooching this berry set over a little bit because I want it to cover that seam. Not that it's going to cover the whole seam, but we want to blur the lines a little bit, as much as possible anyway. Because it's the finish that I'm most interested in, not the paper pattern. The paper pattern is just a spirit guide to help us get it close to where we need it. So now I have this and this in place. I can go ahead and shift this off of the light box and get those fused into place. I don't need the paper pattern anymore. Once I get all the pieces done before I go ahead and quilt this, I will of course refuse these overlapping pieces. I have my steam bottle inside. I went to fill it up, but I didn't bring it back out, so I'll do that before I finish. I have one little berry left over, and I think I'm just going to stick it in here, just because I have it. Don't tell the boss I did that. Now I'm going to see, I think I've got a couple, I've got my trees, my overlapping trees to do still. I don't know if we've gotten, nope, we haven't gotten that seam done yet. We have this one yet to do, and I can put my trees in place, and I think then that's all of my leftover applique. I suppose at this point I'm going to have to download a laugh track, because I made a mistake when I put my wedges together. I should have labeled these very clearly with like a post-it note, block or wedge 1, 2, 3, 4. What I was doing was just looking at houses and birds as my placement guide, and I've gotten them confused. And what that means in my case is if I want the pieces to overlap and not chop any of them off, I'm going to have to open up one of the seams on my wedge and close up another one to make sure that the appliques overlap the way they're supposed to. My blocks are out of order, so cue the laugh track. And I don't think it's going to be a horrible disaster because I can still go ahead and get all of my applique pieces in place. Just where the skirt opens and closes is going to be slightly different. So it's not the end of the world, but even I make mistakes, and I should put the laugh track again. I should say especially I make mistakes. Whenever I'm going to use a seam ripper and it's an area that has the bias edge, what I really need to do is take my time and about every other stitch get the point of the seam ripper underneath the stitches and just go ahead and cut those. Then when you open it up, the seam will just fall apart without distorting the fabric. Remember that this is a bias edge, both of these pieces, and if I just yanked apart the two edges and ran my seam ripper down the middle, I would be pulling on that bias edge, and by the time we got the piece quilted and bound, it would be all roughly like a piece of lettuce, which we don't want. So I'm going to take my time and enjoy these. I call them frog stitches because I'm rip it, and I'm just going to keep hopping along until I get all the way done. The reason I chose this particular seam line is because nothing overlaps here. On my the way that I got mine together, this is the only seam that doesn't have an overlap, so I've just switched where the opening is at. Okay, much ado about nothing. This is the very last piece of my applique that I have to add, and I didn't want to chop this off because of the mistake I made. So I just used my seam ripper to open up one of the seams that didn't have any applique overlap, and that way I don't have to beat myself up too much for my mistake. I'm not even going to put my template under there. I'm just going to go ahead and place that visually, whatever seems pleasing to me. And so I have my entire tree skirt finished. It's not quilted yet. I'll get to that in due time. Well, it's a little hard to show you all of the tree skirt, but I have all of the tree skirt put together. This is the seam that I left open to wrap the tree around, the skirt around the tree, and that'll also have me go in with the binding and get to the center and back out. You could put ties on here also, but we could talk about that later. So I have all of the applique components finished. All of the wedges are together. I did make a mistake, cue laughter, but I'm happy with the way that it all went together. Any of my quilt teachers over the years, I'm sure, are laughing. Some of them are laughing in their grave, but they're probably laughing because I'm known for making mistakes. I didn't cut out all of the circle units at the beginning. I did the first one, and then I decided after I did it that I was going to cut my big circle out when I was finished. I just thought I would get a better curve by doing it all at once using a round template and the small rotary cutter. Having said that, some of you may be thinking, well, I don't need another tree skirt. I've already got a couple. This would also make a really great table topper. I believe the finished size of this is 54 inches, but I'm going to have to measure. But by not cutting the wedge out of the center, you could create a table topper, or even if you did cut out that circle, you could always machine or hand applique any kind of shape over the center. It could be some kind of a six-pointed star, could be a circle, it could be diamonds overlapping, or it could be flowers. something to just cover up the hole that we had made in the beginning with the template. So this would make a really beautiful table topper. Also, as I've said many times, I think this is a great opportunity to spend some time with our younger relatives, our siblings, our nieces and nephews, our grandkids. It gives this some memory and makes it that much more important when people find these things. They become family heirlooms, not just a project that we did on our own. So if you have the opportunity, pull in some help, create some memories, and thank you for going through all the steps of this with me and laughing with me as I made mistake. I hope I didn't make too many. The next step for us is to get this onto the quilting machine. Some of you may have wondered in the past how you would quilt something that is round, and certainly with the slit in the middle, that's going to add a little extra question mark to the process. But we're going to go through that step by step, so we'll see you then. Until then, thanks for stopping by the studio today.